All right, welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today because we're diving into one of the most complex, earth-shattering events of the entire 20th century. We are going to explore exactly how a sprawling, centuries-old empire rapidly collapsed into the world's very first socialist state. Now, the Russian Revolution wasn't just a single isolated event. It was actually a double revolution, a massive political and social upheaval that literally remapped the modern world.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's look at the sheer speed of this historical shift. Over on the left, you've got 3 centuries of absolute monarchy under the Romanov dynasty, a huge, deeply entrenched system of power. And then on the right, the whole shebang completely implodes in just 8 chaotic months in 1917. I mean, you really have to ask yourself, how exactly does a 300-year-old regime just vanish in less than a year?
Well, to make sense of this, we're going to follow a clear timeline today. We'll start with the causes of the revolution, move right into the February Revolution and the incredibly tense period of dual power, then we'll examine the October Revolution, and finally, wrap up with the Civil War and consolidation.
Okay, let's kick things off with Part 1, Causes of the Revolution, the powder keg of autocracy and war.
We really need to begin by exploring the deep-rooted structural failures of the Russian Empire, because the foundation of this collapse lies directly within the Tsarist regime itself. Tsar Nicholas II was a deeply, deeply conservative ruler. He rigidly believed his power was a divine right. He totally resisted meaningful political reform, even after the massive warning sign that was the 1905 uprising. And because of this, he eventually lost his support of the elite, the middle class, and the armed forces. His inflexible conservatism violently clashed with the reality on the ground. You had rapid industrialization, creating this highly concentrated militant working class living in absolute slum-like conditions. At the exact same time, over 80% of the population were peasants, suffering from chronic land shortages and super high taxes. It was a society incredibly fractured by inequality, with a ruler who was entirely unwilling to bend.
And this right here perfectly illustrates why the system finally broke. World War I was the ultimate catalyst. Russia was, quite frankly, totally ill-prepared for a modern technological conflict. Just look at these numbers. Over 1.7 million soldiers dead. Economic inflation running so rampant that prices exploded, rising fourfold by 1917. And the situation in the capital, Petrograd, workers were surviving on rations of just 1,395 calories a day. To put that into perspective, experts estimate an absolute minimum of 2,700 calories is needed for a laboring worker just to survive. The war triggered mass starvation, completely disrupted the economy, and when the Tsar took personal command of the army in 1915, well, he became personally blamed for every single military defeat.
Which brings us to Part 2, the February Revolution, or the first spark in Petrograd.
You know, this first revolution wasn't some carefully plotted conspiracy. It was just a spontaneous explosion of public anger. In Step 1, we see tens of thousands of starving women textile workers going on strike on International Women's Day. They're marching in the streets, shouting for bread and down with autocracy. Then, in Step 2, the regime truly fractures. The protests escalate into massive bread riots, and when the Tsar orders the military to suppress the crowds, the 180,000-strong Petrograd garrison, who were largely sympathetic, war-weary peasants in uniform, they mutiny. They join the protesters instead of firing on them. So by Step 3, totally lacking military support, Tsar Nicholas II is forced to abdicate in March 1917. And just like that, literally, the 300-year Romanov dynasty is over.
Moving on to Part 3. The period of dual power, the 8-month vacuum. So, following the Tsar's abdication, Russia entered a highly unstable transitional phase. Let's define an absolutely crucial term right now, because understanding what a Soviet actually was is key to understanding who held true power on the streets. A Soviet was a localized, grassroots council of workers and soldiers. These weren't traditional politicians in suits. These councils represented the working class directly, and they commanded the actual allegiance and the physical force of the masses.
This creates a bizarre, inherently unstable state of dual power. On one side, you have the provisional government. Now, they held the formal, official state power, but lacked any true legitimacy because they were strictly unelected. And their fatal error,
They kept honoring international treaties and continued Russia's highly unpopular involvement in World War I. Then on the other side, you have the Petrograd Soviet. They held the real domestic power. They controlled the railways, the factories, the soldiers' loyalty. It was this intense tug of war where the formal government was fatally draining its public support by fighting a losing war, while the grassroots Soviets commanded the actual masses.
All right, Part 4, the October Revolution, the radical second spark.
As you can imagine, the friction of dual power set the perfect stage for a much more deliberate revolution. Enter Vladimir Lenin and the radical Bolshevik faction. When Lenin returned from exile in April 1917, he didn't bother with complex Marxist theory in his public speeches. He brilliantly captured the total desperation of the populace with this simple, highly effective slogan, peace, land, and bread. It was exactly what the provisional government was failing to provide. Peace for the war-weary soldiers, land for the frustrated peasants, and bread for the starving urban workers. It was honestly a masterclass in political messaging that rapidly swelled Bolshevik support, especially after they helped thwart a military coup by General Kornilov in August.
Capitalizing on this momentum and, frankly, the lethargy of the provisional government, the Bolsheviks struck. On October 25th, using the old-style calendar, the Military Revolutionary Committee, led by Leon Trotsky, staged an almost bloodless, highly opportunistic coup. They didn't need to fight massive sweeping battles in the streets of Petrograd. They simply bypassed the provisional government by taking physical control of key infrastructure. We're talking telegraph offices, railway stations, the central bank. It was a rapid surgical strike to seize the levers of state.
But here's the thing. Taking the capital wasn't the same as having the mandate of the entire nation. Notice this striking discrepancy. 25%. Shortly after their coup, a national election was held for a constituent assembly. Despite having seized control, the Bolsheviks received less than a quarter of the national vote, losing heavily to moderate socialists who had strong peasant support. So, in response to this lack of a democratic mandate, Lenin's Red Guards forcibly dissolved the Constituent Assembly in January 1918. Russia's brief experiment with parliamentary democracy was effectively ended by force, which, as you'll see, guaranteed fierce resistance across the country.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5. Civil War and Consolidation, Forging the Soviet State. Now, we really must examine the brutal reality of how the Bolsheviks maintained their new, very precarious grip on power. Let's move to the timeline and see how this all builds up. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks fulfill their promise of peace by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending WWI for Russia, but at the cost of massive territorial losses. This humiliating treaty, combined with their seizure of power, immediately triggers a devastating internal civil war against a fragmented collection of opponents known as the White Armies. By September 1918, to crush internal dissent, the Bolshevik secret police, the Cheka, launches the Red Terror. The economy collapses so entirely that by 1921, Lenin is actually forced to pivot to a new economic policy, the NEP. And finally, after emerging victorious from the Civil War, the Soviet Union is officially established in 1922.
Now, the human toll of this consolidation era was absolutely staggering. To win the Civil War, Leon Trotsky transforms a disorganized militia into a disciplined 5 million-strong Red Army, complete with conscription and incredibly harsh discipline. The Red Terror results in mass executions, with estimates ranging from 50,000 to over 500,000 people killed just to eliminate political opposition. To feed the army and the cities, the state implements war communism, which means forcibly seizing grain from peasants at gunpoint. This triggers massive resistance, total agricultural collapse, and a catastrophic famine that ultimately kills 5 million people. Entire cities empty out as people literally flee to find food. Petrograd's population plummets from 2.5 million down to just 700,000.
So, by 1921, facing massive uprisings from their very own supporters, the Bolsheviks realized they were pushing the country way past the breaking point. This forced a pivot to the new economic policy, or the NEP. The Bolsheviks pragmatically retreated from strict Marxist ideology. They ended the violent grain requisitioning and introduced a tax in kind, essentially allowing peasants to sell surplus grain on the open market for profit. It was a temporary capitalist concession, strictly designed to stabilize a totally ruined economy and prevent the new state from completely imploding.
Which leaves us with this massive historical irony to reflect on. How in the world did a spontaneous grassroots revolution, sparked by freezing, starving women demanding basic bread and peace, ultimately lead to the violent dissolution of a democratic assembly and the forging of a highly centralized one-party communist state that would rule for the next 7 decades? It is a stark testament to the unpredictable, often brutal nature of historical cascades. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this structured look at the Russian Revolution has given you a clearer understanding of how empires fall and how new radical states are built from their ashes. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I highly encourage you to explore this fascinating history even further.